This recording is going to show some simple ways that you can keep an attendance grid on Google Sheets so that you can keep it electronically if you're like me and you're not great at keeping up with paper, or if you want to be able to utilize something like this. One thing that makes it handy, I've always found it better for taking attendance to be able to check off people's names as they enter or as I see them rather than trying to wait till everybody's there and then figure out who is absent. So you can use a checkbox. And if you go up to Insert in Google Sheets and then hit checkbox, it will just put a little box right here, and you can check that box on and off to show, whether or not somebody is there. If you want to put those checkboxes over a range, you can sort of drop drag it this way and this way to copy it out really easily or quickly over a large amount of columns and rows and that sort of things, and that gives you a nice little grid you can do that with. Now, one of the things that and so like I said, that way you can do this as you go. You could click here when people were present or not, without having to worry about trying to figure out who was there or not there a little bit later. So that's how I like to take attendance. Now, one thing about it that's also very useful having in a spreadsheet form like this is if you wanted to keep a track of total absences for a student. So in this case, we'll just do it over a week. You could do it over an academic quarter or a series of weeks, or something like that if you wanted to take a look at any trends or needed to keep up with who had been absent how many times. If you go to this last cell here for the total, you can't just use a sum formula, which would be very convenient, but a sum formula looks for numbers. And the thing about checkboxes is they're not numbers. So if I highlight all of these cells in a normal sum formula, it's going to return 0, and it's going to do 0 for all of them because none of them actually have numbers in them. And so that's not very useful for doing this. Instead, what you need to do is you need to use a count formula. Now, each one of these checkboxes, what it's really doing in that cell is it's labeling it either true once it is checked, or it's labeling it false. So if it's not checked, it's giving it a true false value. So instead, the formula that you want to use is a count formula. And what count does is count goes in and looks at values and tells you how many of them there are. Now in this case, because you want to get only the times a student has been absent, the formula you want to use is called COUNTIF. So you do equals and then type out COUNTIF, all is one word, and then an open parentheses. The first thing it's going to ask you for is the range. So I'm only going to select student 1's 5 days for that week, which is C2 to G2. Then I'm going to hit comma. Now the criterion in this case, if you're using a true false, you can simply type in that word as it appears. So in this case, I'm just going to type in false. It's going to turn blue to show it that it's looking for false criterias. You'll notice right here it already shows the number 2, which is how many times this person was not counted present. Then I'll do the close parentheses, and that will give me that count. It will often ask you if you want to autofill. If you want to do it for the whole column, great, go ahead and do that. And so now it's doing that, and for each of these rows, it's looking down that row. So as you can see, this person has 2, these 2 people have none, and each of these have 2. Obviously, if I go back and make a correction, it changes the count, and so now this person is down to 1 absence, which is correct based off that. So again, this can be very useful for tracking the number of absences that a person has. Of course, this only shows a week. If you extended this out to show a whole grading period, you could have it keep track of that person's absences for the entire grading period. Later on, I'll show you how you can use another formula to draw that information into a bigger spreadsheet and then use it to send out emails based off how many absences someone has, which can be very useful if you need to make parent contact, but you don't want to have to sit down and individually email everybody based on a certain number of absences. The other thing I found useful about a list like this is that over here I'm going to create an absence list. When I go into, in my case, it's PowerSchool that my system uses for taking attendance, it needs you to mark the students that are absent. And it's a little tedious to look down this column and as you get to each blank and go and mark what it is. I like to just have a list of doing that. So building on the query formula that I have in another video, if you use a simple query here, and again put an equals query and then open parentheses, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this entire table over here, so columns A through H all the way through, and that way it can pull data from any of those things. And then I'm going to hit a comma, and now to type in the query language, you're going to do a quotation mark, and then again select, because we want it to select some names. I'm going to reference the columns A and B because I just want a list of students. So I'm going to do select A and B, and then you're going to say where, because this is where I'm telling it to look for a certain parameter. And I'm going to say where C, because in this case I want to look at the ones for September 1st. Where C, I'm going to use the equal sign, and then I'm going to write in again, or type in false. So it's looking for anybody where that value in C is false. Then I can do a quotation mark again to close out the query itself, a close parentheses to close out the formula, And when I hit enter, you'll notice that it listed student 4, which student 4 was the only student absent on that day. If somebody else was absent, or if I went back and fixed it or noticed I'd done something wrong, as I click on that, it's going to automatically update it to now show that both of those students were in fact absent on September 1st. Again, I find this very useful because it means that when I go in to put it in the official system that I have to use for that, I can just look and say, okay, the 2 students that were absent are these 2, then click them absent, and then move on. Now, you can do that for that day. If you wanted to keep up with doing it for other days, please note that since these are taking up 2 different columns, you'd have to do another column over here. Instead, what you might want to do, especially if you don't have a lot of names that are the same, is rather than selecting A and B, maybe have it just select B. And then when it just selects B, you'll just get the last names. And so you'll know the last names of the students that were absent. Then if I wanted to do one for, let's say, September 2nd, the next day, so I can keep another list for that, I could simply create another column. And then after I'd created a column for that list, if I drag this formula over here, it's going to get a little weird. And the reason it's going to do that, right now it's still showing the same thing, but it actually is drawing from columns B and I. It actually cut out that column A. If you don't want that to happen when you copy it over, instead what you need to do is in the original formula, put a $sign before the column names in the data that it's going to pull. That $sign tells it to always keep that no matter where you move the formula. So now if I drag it over here, now it says A and H just like the original did, and it will always keep it that way. After I've done that here, in this case, it's still doing column C, which was September 1st, so I would have to manually change that to column D, and now it's going to show me the last names of the students that were absent on September 2nd. Another option is that if you've already taken attendance for one day, rather than continually adding columns, which can lead to a lot of data on there, instead of doing that, you could just take this original column and just maybe name it an absence list, and you know you're going to update it each day as you go through anyway. And then so right now it's still doing column C, which is September 1st, and instead maybe the next day I'll change that to column D, and then it'll give me for that day. And then the next day I'll just go in here and simply change this to column E, and so I get that same one. You'll notice for that it's giving an error because actually on that column I marked everybody present, and so it would show you that there was nobody absent that day. So again, these can be very useful ways to kind of keep attendance in an organized way in electronic fashion, so you can see some list as well as get a total number of absences over any given period of time.